In 52 BC, Rome faced its darkest gamble. Julius Caesar, with his legions weary from years of war, stood before Alesia, a Gallic stronghold brimming with warriors led by the defiant Vercingetorix. Behind those walls waited starvation and fury. Beyond the hills marched an even greater force, determined to crush the invaders once and for all. No escape, no retreat. Caesar's answer was not a charge of glory, but a plan of walls and trenches, so audacious it would carve his name into history. This is the story of survival, cunning, and the empire's narrowest escape. The man commanding Rome's legions was 50 years old, hardened by decades of war, ambition carved into every decision he made. Caesar was not merely fighting Gaul, he was fighting for his own survival in Roman politics. Victory would elevate him beyond rivals in the Senate. Defeat would shatter his career, perhaps even his life. Every trench, every wall, every drop of blood at Alesia was therefore more than strategy. It was Caesar's gamble against annihilation. Across Gaul, the tribes rallied with a fervor unseen before. The Arverni, the Mandubi, the Iadui, once divided, now united in a cause to expel the invaders. They poured into Alesia's hilltop stronghold, a place ringed by rivers and slopes that seemed unassailable. The chieftain Vercingetorix was only 35, yet he commanded loyalty with a fire that drew tens of thousands. His warriors filled the oppidum, their chants echoing across the valleys, a defiant chorus daring Rome to try and break them. Caesar's legions, weary but disciplined, marched into that valley and looked upon the fortress. They knew what waited, an enemy before them, and the rumor of an even greater relief force preparing to descend from the hills. The situation was more than dangerous, it was hopeless by every measure of conventional warfare. Yet Caesar did not order retreat. Instead, he gave an instruction that stunned even his veterans. "If we cannot outrun them, we will outbuild them," he said. The plan was as daring as it was desperate. Caesar commanded his men to construct not one, but two massive lines of fortifications. The first would surround Alesia, trapping Vercingetorix and his army inside. The second would face outward, prepared to meet the relief force that would soon arrive. It was a prison built in both directions, an idea so bold that many whispered it could not possibly succeed. Yet the legionaries obeyed, for Caesar's word was iron. So began the labor that would decide Gaul's fate. By dawn, the sound of axes cutting timber echoed across the valleys. Shovels bit deep into wet soil, hands blistered, and sweat poured as ditches were carved into the earth. From the walls of Alesia, the Gauls mocked them, their voices carried on the wind. But the Romans worked on, relentless, shaping the landscape itself into a weapon. It was here, at this moment, that the survival would be forged from the ground, and history would be carved in lines of earth and blood. The fortress of Alesia loomed above the Roman camps like a crown of defiance. Behind its walls, Vercingetorix commanded tens of thousands of warriors, their morale unbroken, their supplies dwindling, but not yet gone. Each night, fires dotted the heights, signals of resistance that reminded the Romans they were being watched. The Gauls inside were trapped, but not defeated. Their determination was the first jaw closing around Caesar's army, a constant threat ready to erupt at any moment. Beyond the horizon, the second jaw prepared itself. Across Gaul, word had spread of Caesar's siege, and a massive relief force was gathering. Reports whispered of numbers that dwarfed Rome's, a tide of warriors drawn from dozens of tribes, each eager to break the Roman grip. To Caesar's men, the rumors grew heavier than their shields. They knew the day would come when the hills would thunder with footsteps, and the valley would become a killing ground. The legionaries faced a paradox unlike any they had endured before. They were not merely besieging an enemy, they themselves were besieged by fate. Inside, Alesia waited, hunger sharpened into fury. Outside, a storm of warriors promised to descend. Between those jaws, the Romans could not run, could not retreat, and could not fail. The knowledge weighed on every man as he dug, hammered, and stood guard in silence, aware that the earthworks were their only salvation. Vercingetorix played his part with calculated patience. From the walls he sent raiding parties to harass the laboring Romans, testing their defenses, probing for weakness. At times, his voice carried over the valley, promising freedom to those who would abandon Caesar. No one moved, but the words echoed nonetheless, reminders of the precarious line they walked. To surrender meant death by Gaulish vengeance. To resist meant gambling their lives on the strength of Caesar's walls. The work did not stop. Towers rose along the ridges, ditches filled with sharpened stakes, traps hidden beneath layers of earth. Caesar himself rode the lines daily, his face unreadable, his presence both a burden and a shield. He spoke rarely, yet his silence pressed upon the men heavier than orders. It was as though he willed the walls into existence, and the legions, desperate for survival, obeyed with every ounce of strength left in them. What unfolded at Alesia was not merely a siege, it was a crucible in which Rome itself was tested. To be trapped between two enemies, to be surrounded by defiance within and fury without, is to stand on the edge of extinction. Yet it is also to witness the birth of audacity, the kind that forges legends. Stay with this story until its end, for what came next would decide the fate of Gaul and echo across centuries. Gaul was not a single nation, but a patchwork of tribes bound together only by necessity. The Arverni, led by Vercingetorix, supplied the fire of resistance. The Mandubi, whose stronghold stood at Alesia, became unwilling hosts to the final stand. Allies such as the Aedui wavered, torn between loyalty to Rome and loyalty to their own blood. Every name carried centuries of pride, and every decision carved the destiny of the land. In this fragile unity, Caesar saw both opportunity and danger. The geography itself conspired against the Romans. Alesia sat atop a plateau, nearly impregnable, its slopes steep, its rivers curling around it like protective arms. The surrounding hills provided vantage points for enemies approaching from every direction. For Caesar's engineers, it was a nightmare of calculation. For his soldiers, it was a reminder that they were strangers, fighting on ground that hated them. The land belonged to the Gauls, and it seemed determined to resist every Roman intrusion. Caesar's ambition, however, was greater than geography. He knew that victory at Alesia would break the back of Gallic resistance and secure his legacy in Rome. Failure would undo years of conquest, embolden his rivals in the Senate, and strip him of the power he had carved so carefully. Every decision he made was not only a military maneuver, but also a step toward the throne of destiny. In Gaul, he was not just fighting enemies, he was fighting time, politics, and the weight of his own ambition. The legions under him were a mixture of veterans hardened by years of campaigns and younger recruits still untested by terror. Among them were men from Spain, Italy, and the provinces, each carrying scars of previous battles. They had seen burning villages, ambushes in forests and fields littered with corpses, yet Alesia felt different. It was not merely another fight, it was the reckoning of 6 years of blood. In their silence, they knew that what they faced could not be undone. Inside Alesia, life was equally desperate. The Gauls stored grain, livestock, and weapons, preparing for a siege they believed they could outlast. Women and children crowded behind palisades, their eyes fixed on the horizon where hope of rescue would rise. Vercingetorix walked among them, not only as a warrior, but as a symbol. His very presence convinced them that Rome could be resisted, that unity could triumph where division had failed. He was no longer just a chieftain, he was the embodiment of defiance itself. The stakes at Alesia were therefore more than military, they were existential. Rome's supremacy hung in the balance, and so did the dream of a free Gaul. Every spade of dirt dug by the Romans and every chant of defiance from the walls carried echoes that would shape history. This is why you must not only hear, but feel what happened here. If this story compels you, subscribe and join us, for the secrets of Alesia go deeper than any wall or trench. The first cracks in Roman certainty appeared as scouts returned with grim news. From the hills came whispers of massing Gaulish warriors, numbers too vast to be counted. Each report contradicted the last, yet every tale carried the same weight. A storm was gathering. Soldiers listened in silence, sharpening blades that might never strike, knowing the relief force would arrive. The air itself seemed to grow heavier, pressing against their lungs, as if the land was warning them of what was to come. Caesar concealed his concern, but even his presence could not erase the unease that spread through the camps. Men spoke in hushed tones, wondering if Rome had pushed too far into the wild heart of Gaul. They remembered the ambushes, the sudden uprisings, the forests that swallowed entire cohorts. At Alesia, there was no forest to hide them, no river to shield them. There was only the plateau above and the encircling hills waiting to pour death into the valley. From the walls of Alesia, the Gauls tested the Romans without mercy. Arrows rained, sorties struck suddenly, and taunts echoed across the trenches. They wanted to remind the legions that danger was not only approaching, it was already at their throats. Each clash drained strength and stretched nerves thinner. A centurion remarked to his men, "We are not hunters here, we are bait in a trap." His words spread like smoke, not shouted but whispered, because every soldier felt them as truth. The Roman engineers worked with relentless urgency, carving ditches and raising palisades, as though speed itself could outpace destiny. Sweat darkened tunics, blisters broke open, and blood stained the handles of their tools. They were not building triumphal arches, they were building their own tombs or their only salvation. Each trench dug was a line scratched between life and death. Yet still the labor continued, for to stop was to surrender, and surrender was not in Caesar's vocabulary. Vercingetorix, watching from his vantage point, understood the Roman predicament. He saw their walls grow higher and their lines stretch wider, yet he knew hunger gnawed at them as surely as fear. Inside Alesia, he told his warriors to endure. Reinforcements were coming, he promised. Freedom was near. His words fell upon ears desperate for hope, and the fortress became a cauldron of waiting, fire contained but ready to explode once the outer pressure broke. The chieftain's patience was his deadliest weapon. The balance of the siege had shifted. Rome was no longer simply besieging Gaul, it was caught in a snare of its own making, between a starving but defiant army inside and a massive relief force outside. Caesar's men stood in a crucible where retreat was impossible and victory unimaginable. This was the moment when fate leaned hardest against them and the jaws began to close. If this account holds your attention, share it with others, for the truth of Alesia is a story meant to be remembered. Caesar's answer to the jaws closing around him was not retreat, but invention. He ordered his legions to build 2 lines of fortifications unlike anything Gaul had ever seen. The first line, the circumvallation, would seal Alesia from within, denying Vercingetorix escape or supply. The second, the contravallation, would face outward, a barrier against the relief force marching to crush them. It was a prison in both directions, and the Romans themselves were the guards trapped between its walls. The scale of the task was staggering. Nearly 20 kilometers of trenches, ditches, and ramparts encircled the fortress, while another ring stretched for more than 25. Towers rose at precise intervals, connected by palisades and earthen ramparts. Soldiers worked in relentless shifts, their tools striking day and night. Each trench was measured with discipline, each palisade sharpened with grim purpose. What emerged was not simply a barrier, but an engineered miracle, a testament to Rome's will to survive. The defenses were not walls alone. Hidden in the earth were fields of death designed to break enemy charges. Pits known as lilia were dug in rows, their bottoms sharpened with stakes, then concealed with brush and soil. Cipi, wooden stakes driven into the ground, bristled like teeth awaiting flesh. Smaller traps, called stimuli, lay scattered across the approach, nearly invisible until too late. The land itself became a weapon, transformed into a labyrinth of agony for any who dared approach. Caesar's presence haunted the works. He rode along the lines, his expression carved in stone, offering few words but commanding absolute obedience. Once he stopped to observe a cohort struggling with timber and said only, "Build faster than death." The phrase carried through the camps like prophecy. The men repeated it as they dug, turning exhaustion into rhythm. Each tower that rose, each stake driven into the soil, became a defiance against the storm gathering beyond the hills. The Gauls inside watched the transformation with disbelief. From their vantage point, they saw the valley scarred with ditches and lines of wood, and earth stretching to the horizon. At first they laughed, mocking the madness of it. But as the days passed and the works grew higher, laughter turned to silence, and silence to unease. Vercingetorix urged his warriors to endure, promising relief would come, yet even he recognized that Caesar's design was more than ambition. It was audacity turned to steel. By the time the outer ring was completed, the Romans had reshaped the landscape into a fortress greater than Alesia itself. They stood between 2 enemies with nothing but the walls they had built, their lives staked on the strength of earth and timber. History would remember the charge of armies, but the true secret of Alesia was born here in sweat, blood, and shovels. If the resolve of these men impresses you, leave your mark with a comment, for remembrance is built by those who speak. The first assaults came like whispers before the storm. From within Alesia, Vercingetorix unleashed small bands of warriors under cover of darkness, testing the Roman lines. Arrows hissed across the night, striking shields and flesh with equal cruelty. Fires flared suddenly against towers, forcing men to scramble with buckets of earth to smother the flames. Each attack reminded the legions that the enemy was alive, restless, and desperate, willing to bleed the Romans dry before the larger blow fell. Soon the horizon itself began to tremble. Scouts reported dust clouds rising from every approach, the surest sign that the relief force had arrived. When dawn broke, the hills came alive with thousands of Gaulish warriors, their war cries echoing across the valley. Trumpets blared in answer from Alesia, a chilling harmony of defiance within and fury without. The jaws had closed, and Rome stood inside them, encased in its own creation, bracing for the collision that could obliterate them. The relief force attacked with thunderous weight, charging the outer ramparts in waves. The ground shook with the stampede of men and horses, only to collapse into hidden pits or be impaled on stakes buried beneath the soil. The screams of the trapped mixed with the clash of iron, and the earth itself seemed to resist every step. Roman archers fired relentlessly from towers, their shafts blotting the sky, cutting down men before they reached the palisades. Still, the Gauls pressed forward, reckless with desperation. Inside Alesia, the defenders struck in unison. Vercingetorix ordered sorties against the inner walls, his warriors hurling missiles and scaling ladders under a storm of Roman counterattacks. Legionaries fought on two fronts, turning from one wall to the next, blood soaking into the trenches they had dug themselves. A soldier cried to his centurion, "We are drowning in enemies." The answer came sharp and cold, then drown standing. Such words became the iron spine that held them through the chaos. Caesar rode tirelessly along the lines, his cloak whipped by the wind, his face unreadable. He gave no speeches, only commands, his voice cutting through the noise like steel. When a cohort faltered under the crushing assault, he appeared without warning, placing himself where the danger was greatest. His presence steadied the men, for they knew their general would not ask of them what he would not demand of himself. In the shadow of annihilation, his silence carried more than any oath. The valley became a furnace of death, smoke rising from burning towers, cries of the wounded echoing against the hills. Yet through exhaustion and blood, the Roman walls held. Neither the fury from within nor the storm from without could yet break them. What Caesar had built with earth and timber now stood as Rome's last shield, forged in desperation, but hardened by discipline. If this battle grips you, strike the like button, for your voice carries the memory of struggles carved into history. The fury of the relief force broke against the Roman walls like waves against rock. After repeated assaults, their strength faltered, and exhaustion consumed them. Corpses filled the trenches, and the cries of the wounded echoed into the night. When the final charge collapsed in ruin, the Gauls outside scattered in despair, retreating into the hills they had descended with such confidence. Their failure sealed the fate of those trapped within the fortress of Alesia, and silence fell heavier than any victory shout. Inside the oppidum, the suffering became unbearable. Grain had run out, livestock slaughtered, and desperation consumed the mandubii who had offered shelter. Mothers held starving children, and elders wasted away as hunger carved their bodies into shadows. In a desperate attempt to save supplies, the Gauls expelled the women and children from the walls, hoping the Romans would show mercy. Yet Caesar refused passage, and those innocents perished between the lines, forgotten by both sides, remembered only in silence and shame. Vercingetorix, once the embodiment of defiance, now faced the... His warriors, gaunt and hollow-eyed, still clung to their spears, but the spark of resistance dimmed with each passing day. He walked among them with dignity, speaking calmly, though the weight of defeat pressed upon his shoulders. Some urged him to fight to the last, but he answered with measured resolve, "Enough blood has been spilled." His decision was not surrender to Caesar alone, but a final act to preserve what little remained of his people. The moment of surrender became legend. Vercingetorix mounted his horse, clad in his crimson cloak, his long hair braided with the pride of a chief. Before Caesar's tribunal, he dismounted, removed his weapons, and cast them at the Romans' feet. No words were exchanged, for none were needed. The sight of the once proud chieftain bowing before the conqueror was a spectacle of defiance and tragedy, captured not as triumph, but as the breaking of a nation's spirit. For the Romans, victory was undeniable, but it came at a cost carved deep into memory. The trenches were filled with corpses, the earth soaked in blood, and the legions bore scars both visible and unseen. Caesar would return to Rome hailed as a genius of war, his reputation secured, his enemies silenced. Yet for the men who had dug, fought, and endured, Alesia was not triumph. It was survival won by cruelty and discipline, a memory that haunted rather than glorified. History often remembers banners raised and leaders crowned, but at Alesia the truth was darker. It was not the glory of Rome that triumphed, but the relentlessness of necessity. Alesia was the price of empire, a crucible of human suffering disguised as conquest. If these words strike you with the weight of history, consider sharing your thoughts in the comments, for reflection itself is a tribute to those whose voices were buried in silence. The fall of Alesia revealed more than victory. It exposed the foundation of Roman power. Rome did not triumph because it possessed the most men or the fiercest courage. It triumphed because it bent the landscape to its will. Earth and timber became weapons sharper than steel, and discipline forged survival when hope should have collapsed. Alesia was not a battlefield alone. It was proof that survival could be carved from soil and silence as surely as from sword and shield. Every ditch dug, every tower raised, every hidden trap was a statement of intent. Caesar understood that walls could bleed armies before blades were crossed. He commanded not only soldiers but engineers, craftsmen, and laborers who knew that survival lay in patience as much as valor. Rome's true genius was not only in its generals, but in the countless hands that obeyed, building fortresses that could strangle entire nations. At Alesia, their toil outlasted the fury of thousands. Yet the lesson of Alesia was not solely about discipline. It was also about cruelty disguised as necessity. The starving innocents trapped between walls bore witness to a truth seldom written. Empire is not built upon mercy. By refusing them passage, Caesar revealed a darker creed that survival of the few could demand the suffering of the many. The victory celebrated in Rome was bought with silence, a silence that still lingers when the story is retold. Vercingetorix's surrender became a spectacle, but even that moment contained the hidden message of Rome. His defeat symbolized not only the crushing of one man's defiance, but the futility of resisting an empire that fought with shovels as fiercely as it did with swords. The chieftain was paraded as a captive, but the true prisoners were the tribes of Gaul, bound by trenches and walls that taught them Rome could reshape not just their land, but their destiny. Caesar's triumph entered the annals as genius, but for the men who stood in the mud, the truth was more sobering. They saw that glory was a mask worn by survival, and that survival itself demanded an iron heart. Victory at Alesia was not the shining triumph Rome proclaimed. It was the narrow escape of an army that refused to yield. That refusal became the empire's, and it was repeated across centuries in fields far from Gaul. History remembers banners raised in celebration, but the hidden lesson of Alesia endures in the soil itself. Power is not always decided by the clash of arms, but by the patience to endure, the cruelty to deny, and the will to outlast. If this reflection strikes you, subscribe for more stories that strip away the marble of glory to reveal the raw bones of truth, for history's greatest secrets are written in shadows, not sunlight. The echoes of Alesia did not fade when the walls crumbled, or when Vercingetorix laid down his arms. They lingered in the memories of soldiers who returned to Rome, carrying scars unseen, and in the silent fields where the earth still bore the marks of trenches and pits. Rome declared triumph, but those who had stood between two jaws of death remembered it differently. They remembered mud, hunger, and fear, carved deeper than any inscription on Caesar's monuments. Caesar returned to the city hailed as conqueror, his name etched into glory. The Senate showered him with honors and the people praised his genius. Yet behind the spectacle lay the truth that his victory was precarious, won not by invincibility, but by desperation and audacity. The empire celebrated a tale of inevitability, but for those who labored at Alesia, inevitability was a lie. Survival was never guaranteed, and every breath had been wrestled from the grasp of annihilation. For Gaul, the consequences were devastating. Entire tribes were broken, their unity shattered, their lands reshaped into provinces of Rome. The surrender of Vercingetorix did not simply end a campaign, it ended the dream of independence. His people were reduced to subjects, his warriors scattered into slavery or death. Alesia was not just a battlefield, it was the crucible where the freedom of a nation was extinguished, sacrificed to the relentless hunger of empire. Its ashes still whisper in history's corridors. The lesson of Alesia is both brutal and enduring. Power does not rest solely in numbers or valor, but in the will to bend earth, flesh and spirit to survive. Rome showed that cruelty could be transformed into strategy, and that patience could break the strongest resistance. Yet this lesson carries a darker truth, that survival often demands a price so steep it erases the line between victory and tragedy. That price was paid in full at Alesia. As centuries passed, generals studied Caesar's fortifications, scholars praised his genius, and storytellers repeated the legend of his triumph. Few spoke of the innocent starved between the walls, or of the soldiers who wept in silence as they buried comrades in trenches meant for enemies. History, polished by victors, silenced those voices, but silence does not erase. It only waits until someone dares to remember. In that act of remembrance, the truth re-emerges, raw and unyielding. And so Alesia endures not only as Caesar's masterpiece, but as a mirror of empire's cost. To understand its story is to confront the shadow behind glory, the cruelty behind order, and the fragility of survival disguised as destiny. Let the weight of this tale stay with you, and if it has stirred you, share it with others. For stories like Alesia are not relics of the past. They are warnings carved in earth and blood, meant to echo into our present.